thanks for coming. That was a better intro than I thought I was going to get. So, as he said, I'm a Laravel guy for my sins, so please hold your booing to the end for the people watching at home. Oh, yeah, cool, sorry. So, have we enjoyed the conference so far? We had fun? Yeah? It's my first time at an API platform conference and my first time speaking in your lovely country. I'm from Wales, so I'm really not used to this weather. You call it sunshine, is it? Yeah, yeah. I wondered where the rain was when I got off the train here. So, shall we get started? Artisinal API platform. What is it? So, I like to call it putting Symfony developers closer to owning a Lambo. And anyone who knows me knows that I love APIs, and I love PHP, but I'm not the most familiar with Symfony. So bear in mind, I might get a couple of things slightly wrong. I'm quite new to API platform as a tool. I've only been using it maybe 6 months or so I'm probably going to say all of the wrong things. So feel free to tweet me and say, you're an idiot. It's fine. My wife would probably join in. So, as you guessed from the title, I am from the Laravel community, and I've been using Laravel since version 4-ish. And it's changed a lot over the years, but not always for the best. Can I edit that out, right? Just in case Taylor watches us. So, who am I? Hey, I'm a Laravel guy for my sins, and I apologize for that, but this is me. I like to write code a lot. I tweet way too much at @JustSteveKing. Direct all of your insults there. But what I mostly talk about is Laravel and APIs and PHP, but mostly APIs, because that is my one true passion, whether I'm using PHP, Golang, or TypeScript. And I'm quite well known for having super strong opinions. So much so that there's a running joke about code being approved by Steve when it comes to Laravel code. But, you know, opinions are like, as you know, I probably shouldn't say that one. So, I'm a live streamer on YouTube. I typically stream every other week, 2 hours at a time, so it's really weird to talk to people without writing code, but we'll get there. I actually write for PHP Architect. I've got a column called The API Guy, and I sometimes write for the Artisan Way column, but, you know, it's actually a lot of fun being able to write these tutorials. As mentioned, I do write for Laravel News sometimes. I do big, in-depth tutorials. I like to speak at these sort of conferences, mostly about PHP because, well, no one really likes JavaScript. Even those who write JavaScript don't like JavaScript. That's why they made TypeScript. And I'm a developer advocate for Treblle, this company. And by night, I'm Batman. Well, not really, but I do wear a cape, and you've never seen me and Batman in the same room. So, Treblle. What is Treblle? And why would you care? So, Treblle will help your engineering team understand their APIs better. It's a real-time analytical project. And before I worked there, I actually managed a team of developers and 3 different APIs that all used Treblle. And I loved it that much that I came to work here. What it does, it kind of helps with your API observability. It'll help with your API governance, any of your API documentation, analytics, and security. And we got this really cool AI assistant that lives in your documentation that will help you build test cases and integration code for your API, all for free. But enough of that shameless plug, because that's not what you're here to see, right? Let's get back to APIs. So how do we build an API in Laravel? Some of you may know, some of you Symfony developers may hate how we do it, but let's go through it anyway. We start by modeling our data, and that means creating our models, our migrations, our factories, our seeders, all the stuff that we're going to need to be able to save to a database and manage the schema of that database. We then start to define our routes. And the way that we do that in Laravel is we've got a routes file, basically, and we just write down in order what routes we want to define. Archaic, I know. And then we create our controllers, and then we just hook them to our routes, and away we go. Now, if we're going to be accessing any data that you're sending to a Laravel API, we probably want to do some form of form request. And a form request is a really nice way to validate the data coming into Laravel. And once you've got that data, and you've validated that it is data that's valid to be saved, you want to make sure that you're doing some policies. You want to check that the person sending this data is allowed to update that resource, or they're allowed to create a new resource because their account meets certain requirements. And finally, you get to persist it using Eloquent, which I hear is really quite mind-blowing for Symfony developers, that it feels like an empty class and you don't know where all the properties are, and it just starts to look a bit, where is it? It's magic, I know. But that's a lot of steps. And who's got time for all of that? I mean, we've got other things to be doing, right? We could be buying capes or Lambos. So let's talk about modeling data. We start with Artisan. Artisan is your gateway into doing most things in Laravel. It's a command line tool built on top of a Symfony console. And we've got a lot of commands with the make prefix. It allows us to create migrations, our models, our controllers, policies, you name it, even emails we can use a command line for. So we'll go make a model, and we're going to call it thread, for example. And what I like to do is also tag on this -mf. And what that means is I'm going to create a migration and a factory at the same time, because it saves time. So it starts off looking a little bit like this. You might have a little bit more in there, but this is what it boils down to. And you've got a class that extends the base Eloquent model. And yes, I do like to use final classes. The Laravel developers hate me for it. Other people like me for it. I'll let you make your mind up and send it me on Twitter. So we start by linking the factory, and Laravel will do some magic to join the factory to the model. And we can override the incrementing ID by using something like has ULIDs or has UUIDs. At that point, we want to start adding our fillable fields so that we don't get mass assignment exceptions. And for example, here we've got a title, the content category, and a user ID. And then we get to add in our Eloquent relationships, such as belongs to, has many, morph to, morph many, whatever the relationship is that you might want to be covering. So we've modeled our data. That's one step down. Now we want to define our routes. So when you first install Laravel, you don't get any API stuff. Shocking, I know. You've got to actually run a command to install it. So you run PHP Artisan install API, it'll install Laravel Sanctum, and it will create the routes file and register it for you, and you're away with it. It's great. But this is what you get out of the box. And to be honest, I usually just remove it because it's not that useful for me. So what we're going to do, we're going to walk through creating our routes. There we go. So we start off by creating a root group, we give it a prefix, and we use the word as. And that's a way that we can kind of start the name with a prefix for every root within that group. So everything under there, from a naming perspective, will start with threads and double colon. So index root would be threads double colon index, store would be threads double colon store. A little bit like this. So we can make a GET request to the first /, and that will route to an index controller, which has got the name index. So, another step down. We're getting there, right? So, then we need to actually create our controllers and actually use them. So, I usually just create a class myself, but you can use the Artisan console for this. But I tend to use invocable classes because it feels nicer to me. Like I said, I am opinionated. So we inject the request, and obviously we want to return a response. So the first thing that we want to do in this route is, this is the index route for our threads. So it's our list route. We want to get a collection of threads. So let's do that with Eloquent. So we can say threads equals thread query get. We've got our routes. Perfect. So that's all of our threads. So the next step is we kind of want to return that to that end user. Now you can just return the result of that Eloquent query, but if you do, I will hunt you down, and I mean it. So what we will do instead is return a thread resource collection. And what the thread resource is it's a transforming layer where you take your Eloquent data from the database and you transform it into something that's going to be consistent for your API. Then we can pass the threads into that and tell it to return as a resource, as a response. But we may as well inline that, right? That makes a lot of sense. Why create a variable just to return it a second later? And what happens if we've got 10,000, 100,000 threads? Well, we may as well paginate. So Eloquent allows you to use pagination. And most people just reach straight for the pagination method, but that is really messy when you're working with an API because it contains lots of stuff that's useful for your HTML pagination, which your API isn't going to return. So simple paginate will just give you a nice trimmed down version of that, which makes it a little bit easier. And in reality, let's say this is some form of forum or something similar where threads aren't actually updated that often. You can actually then cache them. So we can say cache remember using the cache facade. Ooh, I shudder using facades. I use an enum for my cache keys because it makes sense for me. So we can do cache key threads value, pass through the page, say I want to cache this for an hour, and then just pass in the data, and that's going to automatically return based on that. So we're getting there, right? Another one down, another one bites the dust. Then we can create form requests. So again, we reach for our handy friend, Artisan, and we say, make a request, please. And we're going to call it thread form request, because it's going to be consistent. So we get this out of the box. We get a thread form request class, but it does extend a form request. So by default, you'll get this authorize method, which says it will run through this before it does any validation and say, does this return true? Is this user allowed to make this request? So you can do things like get the authenticated user and return whether they've got a verified email or not. So let's say that they don't have a verified email, this will automatically return false, and they will get the status code saying that they are forbidden. But I tend to do that elsewhere, so I like to remove it. Looks cleaner already. And then we get our rules. These are our validation rules, mapping the incoming data to validation rules that we want to implement, such as the category ID is going to be required. Most likely going to be a string because I'm using UUIDs or ULIDs. And then I'm going to say, I want to check that the ID they're giving me actually exists in the database. Now, this is running a query, which is a bit of a pain, but it is a fast query, luckily. Hoping to find a nicer way to do it soon. So, another one down. We're getting close to actually having an API in Laravel. Then we can create our model policies. Again, PHP Artisan, make a policy for me, please. And we want to call it thread policy in this case. Now, we get a pretty empty class for this. We don't have to extend anything, which is awesome. And we get a method such as create. And what the policies will do is it will inject the authenticated user by default into the policy for you. So in this method, you've got access to that authenticated user straight away. So you can just return whether or not the user has a verified email. You don't have to look up that user. You've already got access to it. And you can also add methods such as the update, or you could add methods which may be more domain specific for you. So this is a forum. It could be, can this user moderate on a thread? Are we allowed to moderate this thread? And you can add your namings as you like. So we inject the thread as well, because we need to inject the thing that we're going to compare against. Now, we can just return has verified email, but in reality, you're going to want to go a little step further than that. So we'll wrap that in an if statement and say, if they've not verified the email, return anyway. That's my first clause. But secondly, I only want them to update threads that they own. So we do a quick comparison using Eloquent here. Then it comes to implementing it. And again, we've got to reach for a facade. I know. So we just want to check to see whether this user is allowed to do an action. In this case, create, we don't need to pass any arguments because we don't need to compare it with anything. But we might want to use update or a custom method that we've created, in which case we would pass through an argument. Getting there? Now we can persist some data. The magic that actually is important. So we might be tempted to use the create method on Eloquent. And if you do, absolutely nothing wrong with that. But that's Laravel magic. That's dark magic. We don't like that. We're at API platform conference, aren't we? We're Symfony developers. We don't like magic. For my next act, no. So we use the query method because that will give us back a new instance of the Eloquent query builder, which then allows us to call methods that will be IDE completable. It will know it's there. It's not some magic that you've got to install a paid extension to find. And we pass through the validated data. But the way I like to do this is any time you're doing any sort of write action, do you really want to block the response going back to the user? Most likely not. So we want to dispatch a background job. This is how we do it in Laravel, using a helper. You can just use the class name and then call a magic method on it, but again, I will hunt you down. So we just pass through some data. I usually add a method to all of my form requests, which will return a DTO. I always call it payload. I've got an interface for it that I add on to every single one, and it just returns an object. So I'm not just passing whole models through to the queue to be serialized or arrays that have no type niceness to it. So we do that. And we can actually create that using Artisan again. Artisan, you can create almost anything. So we'll make a job, and we're going to call it create new thread. Now, it needs to implement should queue, And we've got a trait called queuable, which allows all of the methods on the class to be predefined for us. Quick tip, anything you add should queue and queuable to in Laravel, you can automatically push to the queue and run it in the background. It's pretty handy. And then we will use our constructor to access any data that we've pushed in. So here we're just going to accept that new thread as a payload. Finally, we get to the handle method. This is when the job is being handled. And this is where you get to use dependency injection, which is definitely a foreign word for some people in Laravel, but you can actually use it. So when this job is kind of ready to be pulled off of the queue, Laravel will pull the job and look at the handle method for anything that it needs to inject for you, such as the database manager, because that's actually extremely useful. And what we can do is we can start a database transaction. So what we've got is a dispatchable background job that can fail and be retried. And inside that, we've got a database transaction which will not write to the database. If it fails to do so, it will just kind of bail out, but it will attempt it 3 times here. And this accepts a callback, such as thread query create, passing through the attributes, which is where you are casting that DTO to an array or to eloquent, whatever you might want to call that. That's semantics at this point. So that is happening in the background, so we're not blocking the main thread, so that we can return the response. People can go about their day after having used your API, sent some data. They don't actually have to wait for you to do something. So we finally got there. That was a lot, right? That's a lot of steps to do API requests. And now coffee is probably cold. That is like the worst thing that can happen is you go to reach your coffee and it's already cold. That's what happens when you build APIs in Laravel currently. And we did get there in the end. It took a few steps. We got there, but all we've managed to do is some really basic CRUD stuff on one model or one entity. And most of our applications have loads of these things going on that all interact with each other. And they have sub-relationships to each other so that you can have some intelligence in how you might fetch that data. But before I go any further, I want to take a slight detour. And let's look at something a little bit different. I want to talk about this dude. You all know him, right? This year he was Santa Claus. So he is the API platform lead at the moment, and I've been talking with him a lot over the last few months. And that's really helped me understand the French accent, by the way, because other than that, I'm your typical British person. And he is actually pretty darn awesome. He managed to take a little bit of this magical webby that I've heard so much about, and he had a little bit of this Lambo-toting awesomeness, and he's made something absolutely magical. I was absolutely blown away when I first heard about this. A Laravel package that allows you to use API platform with Laravel, meaning that I can get my nice and easy to use Laravel, which I'm very much used to, but get the power of something like API platform to save me so much time and effort in building my APIs. Pretty cool. Which means I get a Lambo, right? I should, exactly. So let's take a look at API platform with Laravel and what that looks like. But be warned, opinions are incoming. As I did mention earlier, I have strong opinions. Some of them could be good. So we compose and require API platform / Laravel. It all starts with a composer package. Like many great stories, it's got to start somewhere. So let's make our model again. We're going to PHP Artisan, make a model. But then we got all that again, and that's just going to get in the way. So for now, for the purpose of this talk, we're just going to hide all of that, because my screen is definitely not going to be big enough. So we start by adding something a little bit more familiar. We can add the attribute just like we usually would in API platform. We just signal to API platform that this resource is an API resource. And that's all you need to care about. We can take a step further and control the pagination, which we're used to in Laravel. We've got a config option for this, but we can actually do it on a resource-by-resource basis really easily in a central location. We can limit whether it's read-only or read and write as a resource. Did it come up? Yeah, it did come up. Sorry, I'm using some JavaScript fandangled stuff to make the code animate in, so it's slower than I expect. We can also use that get operation as well. And we can actually tie back to that form request that we built earlier. So I no longer have to inject it into my controller to make sure it's validated. I can just go, anytime I'm working with this resource, here is how you validate this data. And we can easily add a post request. We can create a new resource. And this, you might all be used to this, but this is just dark magic. Yeah, I have been writing APIs in Laravel for so many years, handcrafting how I write APIs, and then Kevin and Antoine just undid my whole career in 6 months. Can't believe they did that, but thank you. You've made my life so much easier from now on. So within this, we can actually start to use middleware. So we can tie back to that Laravel middleware that we might be used to using. We can say, any time we're trying to do a post request to this resource, we want to make sure that it is authorized using Laravel Sanctum, for example. And we can actually tag a specific method in the model policy, which means that I don't have to do any magic configuring. I don't have to write any configuration or any rules or anything. I can just say, anytime you want to update or create or anything like that, just use the model policy, which Laravel is going to tell you about, and just use this method, handle the injecting. I no longer have to use that horrible facade. You can actually add more than one, which is really cool. So you can actually use like the query parameters. So you can start to use what Antoine was going through yesterday with all of the different filters that you can then add to your resources. But now for something a bit more Laravel style. Because, let's be honest, we like Laravel. And it's pretty cool. But isn't it going to scare off loads of Laravel developers using these PHP features that are new and not abstracted through magic? It might do. But luckily they thought about that. And you know, with Laravel developers, we still want to be used in Laravel. And we're used to doing things in a very specific way. So let's make sure that we don't scare them off. Instead, let's go back to this. Instead of having to use the attribute, what we can actually do is use a trait and tell this model, this entity, that it is an API resource through the trait. On top of that, we get a static method which will return an API resource. And what we can do with that is we can control how it is returned as an API resource exactly the same way as you would with the attribute. We can leave it as standard and just let it do its thing. Or again, we can pass through pagination. We can pass through very specific operations, just like we did with the attribute. And it's simple and it's easy. And let's say you want to add more than one. You just return an array of them. It's fantastic. It's almost like they knew we were going to ask for it. And this will make a Laravel developer more comfortable, which when you're bringing something like API platform to a new community is probably quite important. So kudos to the team for doing that. And it allows them to focus on things like this. This is something that, as a Laravel developer, I kind of understand. It's just a class, or it's just an attribute, or it's something like that. And I can say that I don't want any output, and that the status code for this is going to be that. And for someone who's used to working in controllers and routes files and middleware and policies, it's something else. Just, what have you done? You've created a monster. But that's not all. Not only that, but we want to be able to configure API formats. And in Laravel, typically what we need to do there is create a new resource, install a package, jump through hoops. Nope, not anymore. We just open up the API platform config. We get this out of the box, and we say, I would like to support JSON LD. Just like that, like it's nothing. Also, JSON API, because we've got a couple of developers who like to use that. I don't have to install a package. I don't have to rely on some third party to provide how I'm transforming my data. We can even return a CSV. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but you can. It amazes me. And our documentation can be returned as an open API, which for someone like me who's allergic to YAML is a great thing. But seriously, it is that easy to use API platform, which I'm probably speaking to the wrong crowd about this, but as a Laravel developer, I just want to iterate how much time and effort that saves. All of those steps simplified into one attribute. Like, what am I going to do the rest of my time? And yes, you can use GraphQL with it too. But I hate GraphQL, so we won't talk about that too much. It's as simple as compose require API platform GraphQL, and it works with Laravel out of the box. Yes, we go back to the config and we enable it. No big deal, quite simple to do, but that's it. Seriously, that is all you've got to do. So let's recap. So, mind you, we are still using Laravel, right? We haven't just drifted off back to using API platform with Doctrine. We're still in this Laravel application. So you're telling me that I can use Laravel, which I know, I love, I use daily, but not use Laravel because I've got to go through so many steps just to get something done, and still have an API, but faster, with an admin panel, API documentation out of the box. There's mobile app and client generation going on there too. There's some React going on. Like, I do all that by writing less code. Like, when did this happen? Just less. What has happened? I'm doing more by not writing code. So, Artisinal API platform is just Laravel and API platform. And what API platform will do is just do all of the kind of hard bits that we used to have to do by hand. And I do like to call it Webby in a Lambo because it's so much easier to remember and it looks so much cooler. So why didn't I use it sooner? A lot of people I've spoken to ask me, why didn't you use API platform sooner? And it is a very good question. I honestly thought I needed to know Symfony. And like really, really know Symfony. And while I knew a little bit, to a certain extent, I wasn't confident or comfortable enough using Symfony to be able to build the sort of APIs that I could build with Laravel. Times have changed, but boy was I wrong. I no longer need to know Symfony. Turned out, after speaking to Kevin, that all I needed to know was PHP, and I love PHP. PHP is awesome. We've got elephants, and we've got API platform, and Lambos. You know, it's great. If PHP is all I need to know, I might need to know a little bit of Laravel if I'm going to use a Laravel package. But that's okay, right? I mean, we're still using Laravel. We're just giving Laravel some superpowers, which is pretty awesome because the Laravel as a platform has focused on full stack for so long that it's almost forgot about the API aspect. So try API platform for Laravel. I mean, if you're already using Laravel for a project and you need an API, just use it. And if, you know, just try it. It's actually so nice, and you get so many things out of the box with API platform and Laravel together, such as the background jobs, and then using Franken PHP with Octane and Mercure and so many things. You can keep using API platform without Laravel if you like. Either way, just make sure you're using API platform. Whether it's Laravel or Symfony does not matter. Just make sure API platform is what you're focusing on for your APIs. And with Laravel, you get that Laravel developer experience, which is important. You know, as a Laravel developer, that developer experience is massively important to me. I want to be able to have an application ready and done in an afternoon. And with Laravel, I can do that. But now I can also provide a REST API that's based on good standards. I write less code, and I can use client generation. So that application that I used to build in an afternoon, I can actually do while my kettle is boiling to make a coffee. And we might even get a Lambo out of it, because we all know that if you use Laravel, you get a Lamborghini. Mine's in the shop, by the way. That's why I'm not driving it here. But thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Steve McDougall. You can find me on Twitter as @JustSteveKing. I'm going to be around for the rest of the conference, which is an hour maybe. But if you want to have a chat, come find me. If you want to give me any feedback, Twitter and my DMs are open. If you want to do it out in the open, tweet me. It's great. I like to have conversations. But you have all been awesome. And I want to thank you all for allowing me to talk here. And thank you for Kevin and the team for building this awesome package, which is going to save me a lot of time. Thank you.